Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this special program commemorating the International Holocaust Memorial Day. This is a day where we don't only think about the past and what it meant in terms of Europe and our history as a people, but also what we're struggling with today. And you'll see polls that all too many British Jews feel unsafe and have considered relocating from the UK over in recent years, and certainly since October 7th. And the fact that this weekend we rejoiced in the emerging of those heroic young Israeli women from captivity in Gaza, some of which were held in tunnels for 8 months. With no daylight and no contact with other human beings, and more information will be coming out about that. And of course, the anticipation of 6 more that will be released as early as this Thursday and into the weekend. And of course, we're all bracing for very, very painful news of those that did not survive this ordeal. Probably the worst ordeal since the Holocaust, which connects us to this day and the memory of this day. So there's much to discuss, much that's happening both in the Jewish world and in the Middle East. We won't go through everything right now, but this is again a reminder of the importance of having the state of Israel safe and secure and able to conduct itself and protect its people, and to build its alliances, and the importance of not just the United States in this era that we're in, but also other democracies, specifically in Europe, for Israel's economy, Israel's exports, Israel's safety. And without further ado, Mark, the floor is yours to introduce our speaker on this solemn day.
Thank you, David, and welcome everybody to ELNET's Monday briefing. It is a day full of emotion as we commemorate the liberation of Auschwitz 80 years ago. And to help us make sense of the past 80 years and perhaps give us some insight as to where we may go with the Poland-Israel relationship, we have Konstanty Gebert with us today. Konstanty is a Polish Jewish journalist who has been covering Israel and the Middle East for over 40 years. And after reading his bio, I can say he has indeed led a full life. He's an academic. He's a journalist who covered the war in Bosnia. He is a researcher who researched the effects of the Rwandan genocide, and he's an activist who has pushed for free media in Ukraine and Russia. In the 1970s, he was a collaborator for the Workers' Defense Committee and a co-creator of the Jewish Flying University. In the 1980s, he worked as a journalist for the Underground Press. And then in the 1990s, he founded the Jewish monthly Midrash. He is the author of 14 books, many of which received prestigious awards. And his latest book, Peace with a View of War, 75 Years of Israel, was published in May 2023. Konstanty is a member of ELNET CEE's advisory board and the host of ELNET's podcast, The Overpromised Land, which is the first Polish language podcast about Israel. Konstanty, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
As we said, today is the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And as we look back or look across these past 80 years, it is astonishing that we are now seeing the rise of virulent anti-Semitism and what I call anti-Israelism. As you reflect on the past and the present, what are some of the similarities and dissimilarities between what a lot of people like to say, it's, we're living in the 1930s again. So what is the difference between the 1930s, the real 1930s, and the year 2025 as it pertains to these rising levels of anti-Semitism?
Well, first of all, you said that this return of anti-Semitism is astonishing. I'm not astonished. We live in Europe. Anti-Semitism has been a mainstay of European culture for 1,500 years. It had been delegitimized after the war. And as we now see very clearly, this delegitimization lasted only as long as the witnesses of the consequences of anti-Semitism survived. With their passing, we're returning to a European norm in which anti-Semitism is an acceptable viewpoint. This does not mean that we're returning to the 30s. In the 30s, democracy was very weak and going under. 100 years later, democracy in Europe has its challenges, like it has all over the planet. I mean, we're speaking about just after President Trump's second inauguration, but it is holding on remarkably well. And furthermore, while in the 30s, the governments were almost without exception overtly anti-Semitic, this is not the case today. They might not be sympathetic to Israel, but it would be difficult for governments to overtly endorse anti-Semitic policies. These might be incremental changes. We might have reason to have hoped for more, but these are not small developments. So compared to 100 years ago, we've made some moderate progress. And this is probably the best we can hope for.
Forgive me. I was looking at this, I suppose, from a slightly US-centric perspective. We've had the blessing of having really a golden age here for Jews. So what we've witnessed in this country is astonishing. I want to get your thoughts on something I can't help but think about. If we look back over the 80 years, beginning with the liberation of Auschwitz, ending almost with October 7th, 2023, they're incomparable in size and scope. Auschwitz and the Holocaust was an industrial size extermination program of people. And when I went to the website for the Auschwitz commemoration and the museum, I couldn't help but notice the word extermination, because I hire exterminators for pests and bugs, and this was a camp committed to the extermination of people. Compared to October 7th, which was on several orders of magnitude smaller in size and scope. But the Nazis knew what they were doing was wrong. They did everything they could to hide it from the world. There are stories of many of these men drinking themselves into oblivion just so they could handle some of this. And I'm not going to say that was all of Nazis, but you heard clearly they felt that something was wrong to be hidden from the world. Yet on October 7th, though it was much smaller in size and scope, the brutality, the heinous crimes that were committed, followed by the revelry of those actions, stands in stark contrast. I'm wondering if you've given that thought, and if there's something you can add to that.
I'm not sure if I agree with the 2 points you made. First of all, the Nazis knew that they need to conceal what they're doing for now because the world is yet unable to appreciate. But they didn't think they were doing something wrong. They thought they were doing something right. In Himmler's speech in Poznan in 1943, there's this fundamental sentence. He spoke to several thousand top SS commanders. He kicked it off with saying, "We all know how it feels to see thousands of bodies piled one on top of the other. We are all the authors of a glorious page of German history, which can never be written. It can never be written because the world is not developed enough to appreciate just how glorious that page is." But to Himmler, to his henchmen, it was a glorious page. And Second, the difference between the Shoah and October 7 is not in the barbarism. If you live in Tigray, Ethiopia today, this is what you expect might happen to your town or village if the war that ended 2 years ago returned. If you live in the Congo today, this is what you expect if M23 partisans march into your village and start murdering and killing and torturing and looting. This is the norm. What is extraordinary about October 7 is that what is the international norm has happened to a first world country. We live mentally in a bubble of immunity. It can't happen to us. It happened to us on October 7th in Israel. It is happening to us in Ukraine as we speak. In the first world, we don't have our cities rocketed and bombed, right? Ukrainians do. So what is important to know that the difference between the Shoah and horrors such as October 7, war in Ukraine, war in the Congo, is that the Shoah was specifically designed to exterminate, yes, that very word, an entire nation. And these are relatively rare occurrences. Genocides, for all the ease of committing them, are relatively rare. And second, whereas the ordinary murderers usually enjoy what they're doing, the sheer physical pleasure of murder and torture and rape, perpetrators of genocide often do not. If you remember Christopher Browning, Ordinary Man, his masterpiece on Police Reserve Battalion 101, which was exterminating Jews in the Lublin district of Poland, they didn't enjoy the killing the way that Hamas murderers enjoyed the killings in the kibbutzim, or the way that M23 murderers enjoy the killing in the Congo. They actually disliked it, but they needed to do it because it had to be done. And as a génocidaire in Rwanda told me, he said, killing people is hard physical labor. A human being is a big animal. You take a machete, it still takes time, and you end up spattered with blood and tired, and you have to go on day by day. But I'm a serious person. I cannot stand aside when others are doing the work. So whereas quote unquote ordinary mass murderers are usually in it for the immediate gratification of the pleasure that apparently quite a few of us feel when we're killing or torturing other human beings, génocidaires are in it not for the pleasure of the act, but for the pleasure of furthering the vision of a better world. They are moral people.
Yeah, I can't help but think of Thomas Hobbes and what he says about the life of man being ugly, brutish, and short in the absence of a social contract. And it truly is when you look in some of around the world, how ugly, brutish.
Yeah, with the exception, say, of the life of the génocidaire. Most German participants in the Shoah lived long lives and died of old age as respected citizens. It's their victims who had lives that were nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah, nasty. Yeah. So I'm a firm believer in the horseshoe theory as it applies to Jews. That is, if you go far enough right and far enough left, you will meet at the Jew. And I think it may be a good construct to try to understand the differences in Europe between Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe in the way anti-Semitism is manifesting itself right now. Could you help us understand the level to which anti-Semitism is rising in Poland and Central and Eastern Europe? And to what degree do you think it's always a problem, but when do you think it's going to reach, it will be a problem enough that it will match what we're seeing in, or if it will match what we're seeing in Western Europe? And perhaps make a distinction between the two if you could.
Well, the post-war evolution of both parts of the continent was starkly different. In Western Europe, anti-Semitism was delegitimized as being the source of the ultimate horror. And France is a good example. France first condemned German anti-Semitism, but eventually had to realize that French anti-Semitism was no better. And anti-Semitism became impossible on the public scene. You could not make an anti-Semitic utterance and continue your career as usual, which probably did not change much what Monsieur Dupont said at his dinner table, right? So what you had in Western Europe was an anti-Semitism that was damned. So on the one side of the dam, it could, in public life, it couldn't present itself. On the other side of the dam, in private life, it probably was as strong as it was before the war. But one important consequence of this damning of anti-Semitism was that if somebody made an anti-Semitic utterance in public life, you knew you have to treat them seriously because they were taking the concomitant risk. In Eastern Europe, anti-Semitism was never delegitimized that way, because in order to delegitimize it, you needed to have a protracted social debate about it, and no social debate was possible under communism. On top of that, whereas in France, the anti-Semites were also the national traitors, Vichy, the collaborators with the Germans, and de Gaulle was very successful in convincing the French that they had all been in the resistance, if only. In Eastern Europe, say in Poland, where the Nazis did not want any Polish collaboration, they didn't want to sully their noble work of extermination by the participation of other subhumans in the Nazi racial scheme of things. The only good thing to be said about Poles is that we're one rung above the Jews, right? So there was no organized Polish collaboration. There was plenty individual collaboration, but you didn't have Polish organizations, Polish institutions collaborating or participating. You could be an anti-Semite and a hero. Polish fascists would die weapons in hand fighting the Nazis. So you didn't have this delegitimization, which also meant that if somebody made an anti-Semitic utterance in public, it could mean that he had a bad day. There wasn't the seriousness that is attached was attached to anti-Semitism in Western Europe. And then with the fall of communism, with the belated coming of public debate, anti-Semitism was included in the collection of attitudes which are a threat to democracy, therefore to independence, therefore to the nation. Anti-Semitism was in a way pushed out of public debate, and anti-Semites themselves have first to stress that, no, I'm not anti-Semitic, and then try to prove their non-anti-Semitic bona fides before they can make a critical remark. At the end of the day, the two parts of the continent conflate. But there is a fundamental difference which still obtains between, again, France and Poland, just to state this comparison. In Poland, the feeling that we all have a stake in the future of the country, that maintaining the country democratic and safe is a fundamental common interest, means that if somebody is seen as acting against that interest, he will be publicly censored. In France, the civic bond has become weakened over the last 2 or 3 decades. And there isn't as much of a sense of common responsibility as we have in Poland today. The bottom line is that levels of anti-Semitism may be roughly similar. Their expression is now more difficult in Poland than it is in France.
Okay, that's very interesting. But we are seeing it in other parts of Central and Eastern Europe, correct? Rising. And where are they coming from? Where are those trends coming from predominantly?
They're coming from the same places they're coming from in Poland, which is the belief that nation is the basic point of reference, nation in the ethnic sense. Narod, as they say in Russian, narod, our ethnic-based group. And because Central Europe historically has always been multi-ethnic, the idea that we have mono-ethnic states is a relatively new thing, and people tend to think it's a good thing. In Poland, 3 years ago, there was a major survey of attitudes connected with World War II. People were asked to express acceptance or unacceptance of different statements related to that period. And one of them was that although World War II was horrible and bloody, it is a good thing that there are less Jews in Poland now. 19% of the respondents said yes, which means that 1 in 5 of my compatriots is willing to accept moral responsibility for genocide just for the sheer pleasure of having a more monoethnic country.
And is that a rising trend?
It's
a plateau trend? It's rising.
It's rising now. Anti-Semitism was in steady decline through the first 15 post-communist years. And then there has been a reversal. It is now rising. And the idea that nation is a good thing, again, nation in the ethnic sense, is much more common in Central and Eastern Europe than in Western Europe, where you still have much of a knee-jerk reaction, like you have in Germany, for example, the fear of us Germans once we're organized as a nation, or the fear of us French, or even us Italians. This is not nearly as strong in Eastern Europe, also because in Eastern Europe, the nation is still conceivably threatened. I don't think that, say, Ukrainians could be convinced to be postmodern in their attitude to nationhood when they're invaded by people who tell them that their nation does not exist. Mm-hmm. So it gets complicated in ways that it does not get complicated in the West, less complicated.
Yeah, it really is interesting, the distinction between Western and Eastern Europe. So I'm going to reference a study, or the release of a study that was just done by the Conference of Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. And they did a survey in the US, the UK, France, Austria, Germany, Poland, Hungary, and Romania. So a large swath across Europe. And what they found was almost 50% of young people in France don't know what the Holocaust is or was. On average, roughly 60% of the people surveyed believe another Holocaust is possible. The high was 76% in the United States, and the low was 44% in Romania, which struck me is quite interesting, that 70% of those surveyed in the United States believe that another Holocaust is possible. And people 18 to 29 are most likely to believe that the number of Jews murdered during the Holocaust has been exaggerated. Now, I know in this country, many states, if not the whole country, the Congress is working on passing legislation to mandate Holocaust education. I assume much of that is taking place across Europe. We appear to be failing. Where are we failing in the education, and what should we do about it?
Look, we failed, and I think we failed disastrously over both parts of Europe and in Northern America in trying to explain what the Shoah was. If you do a Google search of the term Holocaust, which I don't use for the well-known reasons, but it is the most common term to designate the genocide of the Jews, you come up with X million hits. If you do Jews and Holocaust, the number is less. Holocaust has become a general term designating things we don't like and we condemn. And this is especially visible in public debate in the US, the Holocaust of the unborn children, the Holocaust of whatever. Holocaust is routinely used. And in Europe, because we're closer to the event, there is still a certain reluctance to abuse the term in that way, which probably accounts for why in the US the index is higher. I really have no explanation for why it is lowest in Romania. The number of victims that young people believe in reality was much less is a reaction to the education of mistrust. Young people are socialized not to trust the man, the government, the media, the institutions, their teachers, whatever. So if they say 6 million, since everybody knows they cannot be trusted, so it probably means it was less. None of this has anything to do with the Shoah itself. We have not been able to convey the knowledge of the Shoah and pass it on to the next generation. It has everything to do with the conceptual and social mess that our democracies have fallen prey to.
I'd like to ask you about ELNET CE work, but before I do, I want to remind everybody to please submit, if you have a question, submit the question using the link that Randy provided in the chat. And when we turn to question and answer, I will do my best to try to ask your question. So Konstanty, you have been involved with ELNET CE and Marta working with Poland on its national anti-Semitism strategy. Could you talk about your work? What are you trying to accomplish, and what success have you seen thus far?
I think that ELNET has been, by and large, remarkably successful, essentially because it sets itself realistic goals and uses realistic methods of meeting those goals. ELNET helped a lot in exchanges of middle-level specialists dealing in issues that are of relevance for both countries. I'm speaking mainly about Poland because this is the area I just read. One very important factor which Poland and Israel have in common, that in both countries, national security is not an academic discipline, but bread and butter. If you live in the Netherlands, or in Ireland, or in Portugal, well, yes, national security is what you study at specialized departments at the university. We have rockets falling our side of the border. We have Poles volunteering to fight in Ukraine because many people believe that Ukraine is fighting in our defense as well. Therefore, the idea of national security being an objective and important factor to include in all our thinking about social life and international relations is something that is obvious to Israelis, completely exotic to Western Europeans, and Poles or Romanians or people from the Baltic countries are much more receptive to this. And ELNET is working on that. Just now they're having a trip to Israel for people who work in civil defense in Poland. It's about learning about nuts and bolts, okay? The practical methods of dealing with problems. And there is a surprising level of willingness to listen, which is something that really sets Eastern and Central Europe apart from Western Europe. I have public meetings where issues of contemporary Middle East are being debated. I'm just leaving for one next one in 2 days. And I do get occasional nasty questions, but from audiences that are willing to listen to my answers and debate them. I do not run into the brick wall of hostility that I run into occasionally when in Western Europe, I try to do the same. So what ELNET is doing is it is working with this willingness to listen and also this shared sensitivity that Poles and Israelis have. And I think it is making good progress, mainly by being about achieving results rather than about achieving stuff that can be PR'd. So
let me ask you about, sorry about that.
No. Just to wrap it up, it's doing a good job.
So if the trend of anti-Semitism seems to be rising and the trickle down, which is the middle bureaucracy and the higher ups are working closely to build bridges with Israel, is trickling down, which is trending faster?
Okay, it's not only anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is as much a popular move as anti-Semitism. We see that, for instance, in something that's been going on for 30 years now, a popular mobilization of people in the small towns, accepting responsibility for what remains of the Jewish heritage and legacy. This can be high school teachers who tell their kids, their children, the students, to talk to old people. Maybe somebody still remembers Jews. It might be a local civic group that gets together to protect the remains of the Jewish cemetery. Well, the Jews are no longer around, so it's our responsibility because who's else, right? And mercifully, this is not motivated by something that is sometimes called philo-Semitism, which usually expresses itself in gushing enthusiasm about Fiddler on the Roof, Spare Me, or Gefilte Fish, which I find distasteful to say, put it mildly. It is about a feeling of shared responsibility, but also it is about what I believe is fundamental to any struggle against anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is wrong not only because it's bad for the Jews. It is. But if it's only bad for the Jews, why should I worry, right? Anti-Semitism is wrong because it's bad for democracy and therefore bad for everybody. And this argument works. And each time that we have a major issue regarding anti-Semitism, it never is a Polish-Jewish issue. It is a Polish-Polish issue. On both sides, you have credible representatives of Polish civil society. arguing with each other because it fundamentally is about the kind of Poland we want to have. If we want to have a democratic, liberal, European Poland, then it makes very good sense to be anti-Semitic, because people who are anti-Semitic tend to prefer a Poland that is authoritarian, nationalistic, separated from Europe, Catholic fundamentalist, the word, right? So in a way, anti-Semitism is a litmus test that allows partisans of the two Polands to tell each other apart.
That's very interesting. Well, today was the day that people thought Prime Minister Netanyahu would visit Auschwitz, which he never had on his schedule to do so. But I want to understand what was behind the scenes at the ICC. The Prime Minister rushed to make a statement. President Duda had to make a different statement. What was going on in the lack of communication there?
It was, as with the issue of anti-Semitism, it isn't about the Jews. It's about the internal Polish political thought. The Deputy Prime Minister made a statement early December when asked by a journalist that Poland is a member of the Rome Treaty and that therefore it needs to act on warrants issued by the ICC. He did not say that Poland would arrest Netanyahu. He was making an unguarded general statement, which happens to be true. Yes, Poland is a member of the Rome Treaty, and therefore it is obliged by law to act on the warrants, or at least to have them examined by a Polish court. And President Duda, who is from a different political party than the Prime Minister, Duda is from the defeated nationalistic right. Tusk is from the possibly momentarily ascendant center-liberal camp. Duda made a statement, uncalled for, asking the government to guarantee that if Prime Minister Netanyahu comes to Poland, he will not be arrested. Now, Netanyahu never, even before the anti-ICC warrants, intended to visit Poland. This is a hypothetical question about a situation that would not arise. But what Duda was doing, he was trying to compromise the new Polish government in the eyes of the new American president, whom he knows to be very critical of ICC and close to Prime Minister Netanyahu. See, Mr. President, the people governing Poland are bad hunters. We should not have any deals with them. So the Polish Prime Minister, also a Donald, by the way, apart from Donald Duck, these are probably the two most prominent Donalds anywhere, Donald Trump and Donald Tusk. Their names even started with T. The Prime Minister Tusk issued a statement which said that Poland will protect anybody who comes and participates in the Auschwitz event. Now, this is hardly news. The government is paid to protect people in general and foreign guests of the country in particular. What the Prime Minister did not say is that if Prime Minister Netanyahu comes, he will not be arrested, because mercifully, this is not the domain of the Prime Minister. This is the domain of a sovereign and independent court that would have to rule on the validity of the ICC warrant. So the Prime Minister could not say that Netanyahu would not be arrested, because that would mean that the executive has just taken control of judiciary, which I hope I will not live to see in my country. He made a political statement, and the whole storm in the glass of water disappeared. But if you want to look at the nuts and bolts of it, the deputy foreign minister was right. Poland, as a member of the Rome Treaty, is duty-bound to to seriously treat the legal validity of warrants issued by the ICC, which means that if Netanyahu were to come to Poland, the Polish court should examine the validity of the warrant. My guess is that an independent court would have a very hard time in determining whether those warrants are really applicable, since they were made in violation of ICC procedure. And if this were ever to happen, I rather would imagine that the Polish court would refuse to implement those warrants, not on the merits of the case, but because there are serious doubts about the procedural validity of those warrants. But this was never to happen because the whole thing was an internal Polish political backstabbing, with President Duda trying to show to President Trump that Prime Minister Tusk is not to be trusted, and Prime Minister Tusk trying to wiggle out of a very tight and unpleasant situation he found himself in.
Got it. I'm going to ask you one more question, then I will open it up to questions. So for any of you who have a question, again, please submit using the link Randy provided in the chat. Konstanty, Elon Musk recently spoke at an AfD campaign rally, AfD being the Alternative for Deutschland party, far-right party in Germany, and said it's time for Germany to get beyond the guilt. What has been the response by Europeans that you may have spoken to about this?
It's not a question of speaking. It's a major public event. And I think that European reaction was very nicely summed up by Prime Minister Tusk, who said that these are sinister words and very ominous on a day like today. Okay, the problem that Germans have is that it is legitimate to say, well, how much is enough, right? It's a legitimate question. How much memory, how much condemnation of our guilt, how much commemoration? It is a legitimate question. Nobody can legitimately answer. The only people who could answer it are dead, and they're dead because of the reason of the question. In the 90s, when Germany started accepting Jewish migrants from the former Soviet Union, and they were accepted with open arms, given citizenship, public assistance, and whatever, because Jews choosing to live in Germany is the ultimate proof that we are a new and better Germany. When they came in the thousands, there was only empathy. When there started being dozens of thousands, there was growing concern about, well, how many are we supposed to accept? And the reader wrote, I believe, to the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Germany's paper of record, and she said, I believe the moral minimum is 6 million. It is true that Germans have an impossible moral issue to deal with. So maybe they shouldn't have murdered the Jews in the first place. Then they wouldn't have this problem. I mean, I empathize, to be sure. But I really don't think it's anybody's responsibility but the Germans themselves. And Elon Musk trying to do a Persilschein. That's what after the war they called those certificates of denazification that the Allies would issue Germans accused of participating in the Third Reich murder machine. Persil, as we all know, is a German detergent. So it was a detergent certificate. You're now clean, right? So Elon Musk trying to give them a detergent certificate after having made a Nazi salute, I don't think he could survive politically if he were in a European country. I think that would be the end of his career. And it is immensely worrisome that it is not the end of his career in what still is the world's only democratic superpower. So I'm worried. not even so much about Germany, about the US now.
Fair point. Fair point. Before I turn to questions, I want to offer an ELNET commercial for our ELNET International Policy Conference. For our Diplomacy Club members, we'd like to invite you to join us in Paris, May 18th through 20th for ELNET's International Policy Conference. This is an intimate conference unlike any other. You will have the opportunity to interact and build connections with world leaders and VIPs, engage with Arab leaders and civilians in furtherance of the Abraham Accords, an effort ELNET has been pursuing with European countries. And you'll assemble with others in a sign of solidarity and strength with others who believe in the Europe-Israel relationship. Just your luck, the early bird pricing has been extended to February 17th, so I hope you'll rush to our website, sign up, and if you're not yet a Diplomacy Club member, please become one, and we hope to see you in Paris on May 18th. So Konstanty, I've got a question from Bob Linick. So he wants to know, you withdrew from a publication because they refused to allow your article, which described a certain Ukrainian group as neo-Nazi instead of far right. Has that publication stood by its position? And does that group, which wore and displayed Nazi insignia, still participate as part of the Ukrainian forces?
Yes. What I said is that the Azov regiment is a neo-Nazi formation. If people tattoo swastikas on their bodies and their regimental emblem contains an SS rune, well, maybe it is all an expression of interest in Nordic mythology, but let's be serious. Having said that, the Azov regiment was heroic in its defense of Mariupol against the Russians, which I also said in my piece. But this doesn't change the fact that they're neo-Nazi. The paper, which was the paper I helped create, we emerged from the underground in '89, and I helped create the paper. It was made with it for 32 years, said we can't call the Ukrainians neo-Nazi because that's what Putin calls. So my answer to that is, since when is Putin the editor-in-chief of our paper? No, I mean, it's very basic. If you can't call a neo-Nazi for whatever the reason, then I cannot be part of it. There's this great quote from the French thinker Albert Camus, who said that to misname things is to add to the misfortunes of the world. I think that our first obligation as journalists, as thinkers, is to not misname, to call things by their name and try to be clear about what we're saying. So, of course, I very much regret the parting of the ways. But there isn't much I could do about it. If we can't agree that a neo-Nazi is a neo-Nazi, how can we agree on anything else?
John Stuart Mill had a great quote as well. I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's basically the slovenliness of thought leads to the slovenliness of language leads to the slovenliness of thought. So words matter indeed, and kudos to you for standing strong on that issue. Recently, in fact, it was November, Poland sent a new ambassador to Israel. I think it would be helpful to know what the defrosting of the relationship between Poland and Israel has been like for you, and where you see ELNET CEE being pivotal as we develop the relationship further between Poland and Israel.
ELNET is extremely important because ELNET is the neutral space where things can happen, okay? Since ELNET does not hog the limelight, politicians are not worried that doing things through ELNET will expose them to public scrutiny. ELNET operates, if necessary, under Chatham House rules. And to the best of my knowledge, General Cunha, who is now the new Polish ambassador in Israel, thinks well of ELNET. And then more broadly, the Polish-Israeli relationship is, well, complicated to say the least, because it did hit a nadir under the previous right-wing government, almost against the wishes of both parties, because there is a very natural affinity between the former ruling party in Poland, Law and Justice, and the Likud. They are both right-wing populist authoritarian parties, which are extremely unfairly called fascists or having fascist leanings. This is not the case. What we do have is bad enough, but they're very much within the democratic consensus. Both unliked on the international stage. And it was really a bromance at first sight. And it would probably have continued that way if reality did not intervene. And the reality in this case was World War II history and who did what to whom, when, and why. Poland passed what was known as the Holocaust law, which was essentially a piece of legislation that made it a felony to maintain, I quote, that the Polish state or the Polish nation was responsible or co-responsible for war crimes of Nazi Germany in the Second World War, end quote. Now, that's a very interesting formulation, because if anybody wants to accuse the Polish state of responsibility or co-responsibility, they should have their head examined. Poland was the first to fight and continued fighting even after it was betrayed by its Western allies. The Polish state bears no responsibility or co-responsibility. Polish nation was thus a more complicated statement, and I'd like to know, how do the legislators define Polish nation? Several dozen Poles, as in a conservative count, are responsible for the murder of Jews or betraying them to Germany, to the Germans. I call this co-participation. So I'd like to know, how does the legislator define Polish nation? Mercifully, we do not have a legal definition of the Polish nation in Polish legislation, apart from a beautiful formulation in the preamble of our constitution that says, we, the Polish nation, all the citizens of the Republic. So it starts as if we were speaking in the language of ethnic exclusivism that we had mentioned earlier, the Polish nation, and then it goes to define the Polish nation as all citizens of the Republic. But since that particular piece of nonsense that was passed as legislation did not identify what is Polish nation, I published a column in my paper that was before we parted ways, in which I wrote, among other things, that it has come to my attention that numerous members of the Polish nation had in fact co-participated in German war crimes of the Nazi Third Reich. And I'm calling the attention of the public prosecutors of this statement because it might constitute a felony under the new law. They published this and nothing happened. So a couple of days later, I start calling prosecutors I know and telling them, well, guys, I just broke the law in the paper. You might have noticed. And I was given some anatomically implausible suggestions about where can I put my law breaking. But obviously, the prosecutors were not interested in having a show trial of somebody who's a public figure. That law was there to intimidate those people in the boondocks, in the small towns. Again, we mentioned them, right? If they would have put me on trial, well, that would certainly make headlines in the Polish press and possibly in the European press. Last thing they wanted. But if a history teacher in a provincial town is fired, that won't even make it local, right? The objective of this law was to have a freezing effect, and it did have a freezing effect. People changed the topics of their master's and PhD theses. Local authorities withdrew funding from Jewish culture festivals. The authorities have made it very clear what they prefer not to be done. Okay, this law generated huge outrage, both in Israel, but also in the US, Canada, France, and the right-wing government never expected this. And after holding their ground for 6 months, they negotiated a compromise in which they withdrew the felony article, and Netanyahu and the then Polish Prime Minister Morawiecki signed a common statement, which was mendacious about what happened in Poland during World War II. It implied that helping Jews was the default attitude, hardly. It condemned anti-Polonism the way you condemn anti-Semitism. Anti-Polonism is disgusting, like any other bias, and there's plenty of anti-Polonism also in the Jewish community, and it should be fought. Having said that, I still have to meet a Jew who believes that there's a secret Jewish mafia that tries to rule the world, that there is a secret Polish mafia that tries to rule the world, that Poles kill Jewish kids for matzos, etc., etc. I mean, on a practical level, there is no comparison. Bibi signed that because he had the same kind of liberal approach to truth as Morawiecki had. But it didn't rewarm the relationship, although late in the period of the right-wing rule, an Israeli delegation, government delegation, came to Poland to study Poland's success in undermining the independence of the judiciary. The Israeli government wanted to learn from their Polish success. Once the right wing lost the election, the new government is very interested to warm relations up. But then October 7th happens and the war in Gaza. In the April killing of volunteers for World Central Kitchen, one of the victims was a Polish volunteer. And although most Poles believe that 2/3 of the Poles believe that Poland should remain neutral in the conflict, of the 1/3 that believe that Poland should take a position, 2/3 want Poland to be pro-Palestinian. So this simply is not a public climate in which the government can be very public about rebuilding relations with Israel. So they're doing quite a lot quietly, and I expect this will continue.
Well, we're running out of time. Konstanty, that was really quite interesting. A lot of information, a lot of history, very much appreciated. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to turn the floor over. Actually, before I do, I just want to let everybody know next Monday, we are going to be discussing Turkey. Chaya Eitan Cohen-Yanorocik from the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies at Tel Aviv will be joining us. So tune in next week.
You're lucky to have him. He's a very good specialist.
There you go. An endorsement from Konstanty about Chaya Eitan Cohen-Yanorocik. So everybody join us next week. Tom, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you very much. I'll make it short. I know we're running out of time. Thank you, Konstanty. It was a wonderful presentation. As always, it's good to hear from you. I just want to make a couple of comments. First of all, Mark, when you referenced pre-World War II Europe and comparing it today, and I happen to always feel that there is also something else coming into factor, and that is the demographic trends in Europe that puts additional pressure on anti-Semitism. And in the end, I look at the Jewish history almost as a two-track approach. One, there is an intellectual spirit with custom, tradition, cultural, and there's also a survival instinct. And the survival instinct is the resilience. And the two go together in a way that is basically unprecedented in world history, how the Jews have been able to survive what they've been able to survive. And that resilience is a clear message. And for those countries in Eastern Europe, especially that are looking for a democracy, looking for freedom and opportunity, democracy is the answer. And so we hope that education will rise, people will learn and understand better. But I agree with you, Konstanty. Anti-Semitism is something that we live with. And it will, because people are usually envious of other people that have something. They're not envious of something of people that have nothing. And so maybe they feel that they're victims, or they feel sorry, or whatever it is. But, I like the dual tracks that our history and our tradition provides us. And I like the work that we're doing at ELNET. And I agree, we're making tremendous inroads. And this is all possible with the support that we're getting from all our supporters throughout the world. And the numbers are increasing, and our popularity is increasing. And it's because we're fighting for democracy and freedom in the free world. So those are my comments, just that in the interest of time. And again, I want to thank everybody, and I appreciate everybody's support. And we look forward to seeing you again next week. And by the way, my parents were Holocaust survivors. My wife's mother was an Auschwitz survivor. And so, we know intimately what this day means. And, just thank God we have a history of what we do, and we're here today talking about our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Konstanty, again. And everybody, please enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.